Officer Grant had gotten away with racism for years. In his world, black people had no power, especially black women. So when he walks into a courtroom and disrespects a woman who looks out of place, he doesn't think twice. But today, he made a mistake. Because the woman he just demeaned, threatened, and humiliated, she's the new judge, and she is about to show him exactly how much power she holds. The courtroom buzzed with low murmurs as officers and legal professionals shuffled into their seats, preparing for the day's proceedings. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floors. A sense of quiet anticipation hung in the air. Today was important. A new judge was taking the bench. Officer Grant stood near the entrance, arms crossed, exuding his usual air of arrogance. He was a seasoned cop, the kind who had walked through these halls for years without consequence. His reputation? Untouchable. His methods? Questionable at best. But that never mattered. He always got away with it. Grant's eyes locked onto a black woman in a tailored navy blue suit walking toward the judge's bench, a leather case file in hand. His brow furrowed. Something about her felt out of place. Too confident. Too self-assured. He scoffed and stepped into her path, tilting his head slightly. "Court officials only," he muttered, eyes scanning her from head to toe. "You're in the wrong place, sweetheart." The woman stopped, but didn't flinch. She met his gaze with an unwavering intensity, her posture straight, composed, not the reaction he expected. "Excuse me?" she asked, voice calm but firm. Grant smirked, taking a step closer, lowering his voice. "I don't know what you're doing here, but trust me, you don't belong." She inhaled slowly, as if measuring the weight of the moment. Then she moved to step past him. Grant's hand shot out, gripping her wrist with just enough pressure to make a point. His fingers dug into her skin, an unmistakable display of power. A sharp gasp echoed from a nearby black female attorney, who instinctively stepped forward. "Officer, let her go." But Grant barely glanced at her. Instead, he leaned in toward the woman he was restraining and whispered under his breath, "People like you don't get to act like you run things." Then, a voice, authoritative, cutting through the tension like a blade, rang out from the front of the room. "All rise for Judge Naomi Carter." A heavy silence crashed over the courtroom. Grant's grip loosened as if his fingers had suddenly lost strength. His heart pounded. He blinked in disbelief, looking around, expecting someone to correct what he just heard. The woman, the same woman he had just insulted, grabbed and demeaned, stepped past him and ascended to the judge's bench. Judge Naomi Carter. The entire room stood, a wave of movement and stunned whispers filling the air. Grant's throat went dry. He tried to swallow the growing panic, but it was useless. He had just assaulted the new judge. Naomi adjusted her robe, took her seat, and finally, after an agonizing beat, looked directly at him. "Officer Grant," she let his name linger in the air like a sentence being passed. "I believe we need to have a discussion about what just happened." A tense silence filled the courtroom, pressing against Officer Grant's chest like an unbearable weight. The murmurs of the crowd swirled around him. Disbelief, curiosity, suppressed amusement. He had spent years walking into courtrooms like he owned them, smirking at judges, intimidating attorneys, and walking free despite dozens of complaints against him. But now, the power dynamic had shifted, and he could feel it crushing him. Judge Naomi Carter didn't break eye contact. Her expression remained calm, controlled, but there was something sharp in her gaze, something dangerous. Grant forced himself to stand straighter, gripping the leather belt around his waist. He had handled criminals, thugs, protesters. He could handle her, or so he thought. Before Naomi Carter was a judge, she was a daughter, a sister, a child who had watched her father get dragged away in handcuffs for a crime he didn't commit. She had been only 12 years old when the police burst through their front door. Her father, an honest, hard-working man, accused of stealing from his own workplace. The cop who had arrested him, a white officer with the same smug expression Grant wore now. Her father had begged for the truth to be heard, but no one listened. He was convicted on fabricated evidence, sent away for 3 years, while Naomi's family struggled to survive. By the time he was released, the damage had been done. He had lost his job, his health, and his faith in justice. Naomi swore that day that she would become the very thing that had failed her father, a force of justice that couldn't be silenced, manipulated, or bought. She had fought twice as hard as her classmates in law school, had sat through countless moments of doubt, discrimination, and dismissal. She had heard the whispers, "She's too young, she's too black, she's too ambitious." And yet, here she was, a judge, the highest authority in this courtroom, and the very same type of man who ruined her father's life was now standing in front of her, caught in the headlights of his own arrogance. Meanwhile, Officer Grant had his own history, but his was one littered with complaints, brutality, and manipulation. Years of misconduct, dozens of excessive force allegations, a reputation for targeting black civilians. And yet, each time he walked away untouched. His superiors protected him. His victims? Brushed aside, forgotten. He thrived on power, thrived on knowing that no one could touch him. Until today. The courtroom showdown begins. Naomi leaned forward slightly, her fingers tapping the bench. Officer Grant approached the bench. A bead of sweat trickled down his temple. He hesitated. Now, slowly, stiffly, he walked forward, his boots feeling heavier with each step. He wanted to defend himself, crack a joke, make some excuse, anything to regain control. But as he looked into her unwavering gaze, something cold settled in his stomach. For the first time in his life, he wasn't the one holding the power, and he was about to find out just how much that power was about to be turned against him. Officer Grant's boots felt like lead as he approached the bench. The courtroom had fallen into a dead silence, the weight of Naomi Carter's gaze pressing down on him like a gavel about to strike. He tried to compose himself, to find the smirk he usually wore when walking into courtrooms, but something was wrong. He could feel it. This wasn't just another case. This wasn't just another day in court. Today, he wasn't the enforcer of the law. Today, he was the one under scrutiny. As Grant stood in front of Naomi's bench, a side door creaked open, and a young black man in an orange jumpsuit was led into the courtroom by a bailiff. Naomi's expression didn't change, but Grant felt his stomach tighten. He knew that face. Jamal Harris. A 19-year-old he had arrested just last month. A kid he had slammed to the ground, handcuffed, and thrown into the back of a police car. The charge? Resisting arrest. The truth? Jamal had simply asked why he was being stopped. Naomi turned toward the defense attorney, a sharp woman in her 40s with a no-nonsense demeanor. "Ms. Wallace, please present your case." The attorney stood, sliding a USB drive onto the evidence table. "Your Honor, what you're about to see is bodycam footage from Officer Grant's patrol car on the night he arrested my client." Grant's throat went dry. Bodycam footage? That wasn't possible. He had turned it off, hadn't he? The courtroom's large TV monitor blinked to life, and grainy footage filled the screen. At first, it showed nothing out of the ordinary. Grant stepping out of his squad car, approaching Jamal on a dimly lit sidewalk. Then, the sound kicked in. Jamal's voice was clear. "Why are you stopping me, officer?" Grant's voice followed. "Don't ask questions. Hands where I can see them." Jamal didn't move aggressively. He didn't resist. But then, Grant shoved him. Hard. The camera caught everything. The slam of Jamal's body against the pavement. The crack of his head against the curb. The pained groan as Grant's knee pressed into his back. Then, the words that sealed Grant's fate. "I can charge you with whatever I want, boy." The courtroom erupted. Gasps. Shocked whispers. Even some of Grant's fellow officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Naomi's jaw tensed as she paused the video. She turned her gaze toward Grant, who now looked visibly shaken. "Officer Grant," she said, her voice eerily calm. "Do you deny that this is you in the video?" Grant's pulse hammered in his ears. "Deny it. Lieutenant, say it's been edited. Say anything." But he could feel it now. The power shift. Naomi wasn't like the other judges he had faced. She wasn't afraid of him. She wasn't going to let him walk away. For the first time in his career, Officer Grant was trapped, and this was only the beginning. The courtroom was still buzzing from the bodycam footage revelation, whispers spreading like wildfire. Officer Grant stood frozen, his face pale. He could feel the shift happening, his usual shield of power crumbling. Naomi let the silence drag, let it sink in. Then, she turned to the defense attorney. "Ms. Wallace, do you have any additional evidence to present?" Wallace smirked, reaching into her briefcase. "Actually, Your Honor, we do." Grant's chest tightened. What else could they possibly have? Wallace slid another flash drive onto the evidence table. "We received an anonymous tip just this morning. A whistleblower, from within Officer Grant's own department." The room erupted again. Even Naomi's eyes flickered with intrigue. A cop, turning against Grant. She gestured for the bailiff to retrieve the drive. Moments later, the screen flickered to life again. And that's when everything changed. The whistleblower's statement. The truth comes out. The video opened in a dimly lit garage, where a silhouetted figure in a hoodie faced the camera. Then, a voice spoke. "My name doesn't matter. What matters is that Officer Grant has been getting away with this for years." Grant's breath hitched. "I've seen him plant drugs on people. I've seen him lie in reports. I've seen him beat black men and laugh about it afterward. He told us the system would always protect him, that nobody would care enough to fight back." Gasps, murmurs. Some of the officers in the courtroom shuffled uncomfortably, their eyes darting to Grant. The voice continued. But this time he made a mistake. He didn't know his body cam was still on. And now, it's over. The video cut to black. Silence. Grant felt the world tilt beneath him. Naomi sat back in her chair, hands folded. "Officer Grant, do you have anything to say?" His mouth opened, closed. Nothing came out. He had spent his whole career in control, manipulating, twisting the truth. But now, he was drowning. Naomi's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "I will be formally recommending an immediate investigation into Officer Grant's actions and his department's handling of misconduct complaints." The crowd stirred. Grant's heart pounded. No. This wasn't happening. But Naomi wasn't finished. "And in the meantime," she turned to the bailiff, "Officer Grant is to be placed under temporary suspension pending review." His vision blurred, suspended, investigated, exposed. The walls were closing in, and for the first time in his life, Officer Grant had no way out. The air in the courtroom felt electric. The walls seemed to be closing in on Officer Grant, trapping him in a reality he never thought he'd face. His heart pounded in his chest, the word suspension echoing in his mind. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. People like him didn't face consequences. He had always walked away. Not this time. Grant's hands curled into fists as his lawyer whispered something in his ear. The attorney looked shaken, scrambling through paperwork, trying to find a way out. Grant suddenly straightened up, clearing his throat, forcing a smirk onto his face. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this is outrageous." He spread his hands, feigning disbelief. "This so-called evidence is hearsay. An anonymous witness? Suspiciously perfect timing?" Naomi didn't blink. "The body cam footage says otherwise." Grant gritted his teeth. "I was doing my job." His voice turned desperate. "Do you know how many criminals I've taken off the streets?" Naomi tilted her head slightly, studying him the way a scientist might examine a specimen under a microscope. "Criminals," she repeated, her voice dangerously soft. She tapped a button on the courtroom monitor. The paused image of Jamal Harris slammed to the pavement reappeared on the screen. The courtroom fell silent. Jamal, 19 years old, beaten, arrested, labeled a criminal for questioning his own detainment. Naomi's gaze didn't waver. That young man was never a criminal. Grant's face reddened, but Naomi wasn't done. Ms. Wallace, Jamal's defense attorney, stood up again, holding another USB drive. "Your Honor, we have additional evidence from another case. One Officer Grant was involved in just 6 months ago." Grant's stomach plummeted. Number Wallace slid the drive into the computer. The monitor flickered, revealing another traffic stop. Another black man dragged from his car. The voice on the recording was unmistakable. Grant's voice. "Shut your mouth. You don't get to question me." Then, a punch, a grunt of pain, a laugh from Grant. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Even some of the officers seated in the gallery looked disgusted now. Naomi finally leaned forward, her voice like steel. "Officer Grant, you have spent years abusing the power entrusted to you, and today, you're finally being held accountable." Grant's mind spun, frantic, searching for a way out, but he could see it in her eyes. He was done. Officer Grant's world was collapsing around him. His body felt numb, his mind racing as the evidence piled up like bricks, sealing his fate. The bodycam footage, the whistleblower's testimony, the second USB drive. It was all too much. His own brothers in blue, the ones who once laughed with him, who covered for him, weren't looking at him now. Some avoided his gaze. Others, their disgust was clear. He was alone. Grant's fingers tightened into fists at his sides. His lawyer was still scrambling, whispering rapid legal jargon in his ear, but it all sounded like white noise. His career, over. His power, gone. Unless... A flicker of something desperate flashed in his eyes. He took a sharp breath and tried to regain control the only way he knew how, by blaming someone else. I wasn't the only one. His voice was rough, unsteady. You think I did this alone? You think I was the only officer following orders? The courtroom stilled. Naomi remained calm, but her fingers steepled slightly, as if she had been waiting for him to say those exact words. Go on. Grant hesitated. He had been so careful, keeping his tracks covered, making sure he wasn't the only one pulling the strings. But now, he was drowning, and he wasn't going to sink alone. He exhaled sharply. I have names. A murmur rippled through the room. Some officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Grant's heart pounded as he latched onto the only chance he had left. You let me walk out of here today, and I'll give you everyone involved. The entire precinct gasps. Shock, the deal of a lifetime. For the first time in the entire trial, Grant felt hope. Naomi didn't react. She simply let his words sit there, hanging in the air like smoke after an explosion. Then, she laughed. A low, knowing, almost amused laugh. Grant's hope curdled into confusion. Why was she laughing? Naomi shook her head, her voice measured, deliberate. You don't get to negotiate, Officer Grant. His breath hitched. What? She leaned forward slightly, locking eyes with him. You think you're the first corrupt cop who's tried to save himself by throwing others under the bus. You think you're the first officer to act like a king, only to come crawling when the walls close in. The courtroom was deathly silent. Naomi's expression was stone cold. You're not making a deal. You're making a confession. The color drained from Grant's face. Naomi turned to the bailiff and said the words that would change his life forever. Officer Grant is officially placed under arrest. A thunderous wave of gasps and murmurs erupted as officers stepped forward. Grant panicked, stepping back. Wait! No, no! He tried to lunge, tried to fight, but his own fellow officers grabbed his arms, shoving him down onto the table, slapping cuffs around his wrists. It was over. He was the one in chains now. Naomi stood tall, watching as Grant was finally dragged out of the courtroom, shouting, screaming, but no one was listening. For the first time in his life, Officer Grant had no power, and Naomi Carter had just delivered the justice he had spent a lifetime running from. The city was still buzzing from the trial. News headlines flashed across television screens, radio talk shows dissected every detail, and social media was on fire. Corrupt officer brought down in historic courtroom battle. Justice served. Officer Grant exposed, facing multiple charges. Judge Naomi Carter ends a culture of silence. Grant had officially been fired from the police force. His badge, once a symbol of untouchable power, had been stripped from him in a public hearing. But that wasn't the worst part. His entire department was now under federal investigation. Several of his former colleagues had turned on him, trading testimony in exchange for lighter sentences. The plea deals meant one thing. Grant was finished. He now faced multiple lawsuits, criminal charges, and worst of all, a system that finally saw him for what he was: a fraud, a bully, a disgrace. Meanwhile, Jamal Harris, the young man Grant had falsely arrested, walked into the same courtroom that nearly ruined his life. This time, his record was being officially cleared. Naomi watched as the judge overseeing Jamal's case delivered the final verdict. All charges against Mr. Harris are hereby dismissed. He is free to go. A collective exhale rippled through the crowd. Jamal's mother sobbed in relief, clutching her son's hand. Jamal turned toward Naomi, eyes filled with something deeper than gratitude. Hope. She nodded at him, a silent promise that his fight had not been in vain. As Naomi left the courtroom that day, reporters swarmed her, microphones and cameras flashing. "Judge Carter, what's next?" one of them asked. Naomi paused, her heels clicking against the polished marble floor. She looked directly into the camera, her voice calm, unwavering. "This isn't just about one officer. This is about making sure no one else suffers under a broken system." The camera zoomed in, capturing the fire in her eyes. Justice isn't just about punishing the guilty. It's about protecting the innocent. She turned, walking away as her words rippled through the air like a shockwave. And just like that, the world knew this fight wasn't over. A cold breeze whispered through the courthouse steps as Judge Naomi Carter stepped outside. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, a fitting symbol of a new era beginning. Behind her, the echoes of the trial still lingered. Justice had been served, but the fight wasn't over. She paused at the top of the stairs, her hands clasped in front of her as she looked out at the gathering crowd. Reporters, activists, citizens, all waiting, all watching. A journalist called out, shoving a microphone forward. "Judge Carter, what message would you give to those who abuse their power?" The question hung in the air. The world was listening. Naomi took a breath, her voice steady, unshaken. "You thought no one would ever hold you accountable. You were wrong." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was powerful. It was deafening. Naomi turned and walked away, her heels clicking against the pavement, each step a reminder that justice had a new face, and it wasn't backing down. As she disappeared into the courthouse, the camera zoomed in on the engraved words above the entrance, "Equal justice under law." For years, those words had felt like a lie, but today they finally meant something.